Fabricadabra at LPL presents Cutesy Kitchen Towels. Today, we'll make an adorable hanging towel for an oven handle in a kitchen. We'll also learn to make a buttonhole using the sewing machine. Included in the grab-and-go kits are two different but completely patterned fabrics, a plain white hand towel, a button, a pattern courtesy of LittleHouseLiving.com, and written instructions. You will need to provide the following: thread that contrasts or blends in with both patterns, as well as the usual sewing notions such as pins, needles, scissors, an iron, and a sewing machine. Let's begin. First, we're going to cut the hand towel to a reasonable size. If you have one of our kits, you can either cut the towel into two equal pieces along the short edge, or you can cut the top quarter of the towel along the long edge. Right here, I'm cutting down the middle of the towel to get two shorter towels. And as you can see, what you're going to end up with is three finished edges on a towel and then one unfinished edge. And the unfinished edge is what we are going to gather and then place inside of the handle and then sew it inside the handle. Okay, so next up is I'm going to show you how to do the quarter top. And again, I'm not measuring this for the cutting it in half. I just use the crease in the middle. For this one, I'm putting one edge down about a quarter of the way, and I'm just eyeballing it, but you can measure it if you'd like. And then I'm going to cut along that seam that I've made, or along that crease I've made. And I suggest doing it this way because it's a little difficult to cut on this towel because it's thicker than regular fabric. And again, you're going to be left with three finished edges and one unfinished edge that we're going to gather. Okay, so next we're going to trace the handle pattern onto each piece of fabric once. So you're going to have two different patterned fabrics that complement each other. And we're going to trace the pattern once on each. Or you can trace the pattern once on one and then put both together. It's kind of up to you. So right here, I'm going to place my pattern down. I'm going to align the bottom edge of the pattern with the bottom edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to trace this. I would suggest using some sort of fabric marker that's non-permanent. Right here, I'm just using a watercolor pencil. You'll also notice that I have laid the fabric right side down, or the nicer part of the pattern facing down. That way the marks I'm making aren't going to actually show on the finished piece. Okay, and then I'm going to be making two towels. You're probably not going to be making two towels, so that's why I'm folding this in half, because I'm going to end up with four pieces, two pieces for each towel. And you can't see my pattern marking, but I see it, and I'm just cutting around that edge. And take your time. You don't have to do this quickly. I've sped it up so that you don't have to sit there while I cut this slowly. So okay, that leaves me with two handle pieces of the same pattern. And I did the same for the other fabric. And so that's going to leave me right here with two individual patterns. I'm going to lay one of the patterns right side up, and I'm going to lay the other pattern right side down on top, right on top of it. And I'm going to align those edges so they match up. And then I'm going to pin this into place so that it doesn't move around while I'm sewing. And I'm just showing you this part. You don't have to use pins. A lot of sewists now will use clips, the sewing clips or fabric clips, to hold the piece in place. It's kind of up to you. I'm old school, so I use pins. But one day I'm going to get me some clips and see how that works. And you're going to notice as I get to the end of this that I'm not actually going to pin the flat edge of the pattern pieces. I'm not going to pin that together because I'm not going to be sewing that just yet. So right along here, that part we're not going to sew. We're just going to sew around the rest of it. So right here is where I've sewn, and I'll just let you know I just used a regular straight stitch to sew this with the machine default settings for the regular stitch. And I'm pretty close to the edge. It's about a 1/4 inch seam. I did not sew this perfectly because I was in a hurry, so it doesn't have the curves aren't exact. Right here what I'm doing is clipping the edges. And you want to do this anytime you have curves. This helps take out some of the bulk in those edges. Another thing you can do is cut it. I'm about to do that here. Cut it very close to the stitched seam line without actually cutting the stitches. You never want to cut the stitches because that's going to ruin the whole point of stitching it. So now I'm going to go back to clipping right here. And I'm going to do the same for the other pattern piece or the other handle piece. Okay, and so now we're going to want to turn this inside out. So we want to turn it right side facing outwards. Right now we have it wrong side facing out, so we're going to turn it right side facing out. And you just want to use like your finger to go around the edges of the seams so that you've pushed them out. And you should get a fairly symmetrical, mine's not perfectly symmetrical, but a fairly symmetrical handle piece that we're going to sew onto the towel. Okay, so once I'm done with this part, then we're just going to iron that on a medium heat iron so that the edges lay flat. Okay, and that's this here. I've ironed it, and so it's nice and flat. And then you'll also notice that I turned under the bottom flat edges. I turned those under just a little bit and then ironed those as well. That way we have no raw edges showing. Okay, so next up what we're going to do is gather that one edge, that unfinished edge of the towel. And I'm using embroidery thread. I'm using a full skein, so all 6 thread of the embroidery floss. And you don't need a whole lot of it. And I'm going to thread my needle, use an embroidery needle. And we're using embroidery floss and a needle because the towel itself is very loosely woven. And so doing this on a machine or doing this with less thread is just not going to work out really well. So now I'm tying a knot on the end of the thread. And again, because this is loosely woven, I'm going to have to put 2 knots in right on top of each other. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Form a second knot so it gets a larger knot because there's actually 2 knots there right on top of each other. Okay. And then we're going to start sewing that unfinished edge. or gathering. So we're using a basting stitch, and I'm just going to come up from the back, pull it through, and then I'm just going to try and keep my stitches fairly even and a little bit lengthy, but not terribly long. And you can just kind of go along like I'm doing here, where I'm just sort of creasing it. I'm gathering it and creasing it, and then just pushing the needle through. Okay, and here's another spot. Oh, yeah. So again, you're just going to go, up from the back, over a stitch length, down, then over another stitch length underneath, up, and then over another stitch length. You're not going to do a back stitch. You're just going forward. And this is going to allow us um, to gather it. It's going to allow us to pull the thread or the floss through and make it a gathered edge there. So you can see right here, I've gotten about, halfway almost, and I'm just going to finish it all the way to the edge. Then when I get to the edge, I'm not going to tie it off yet, because I need to make sure that this is going to fit inside the handle and look nice. So I want to make sure I'm going to grab the handle, and I'm just going to line it up with that bottom flat edge to make sure that that's going to go from one edge to the other, one end of the edge to the other, and look nice with the gathering. Okay, so that looks good. And now what I'm going to do is tie this off, and again I want to use double knots just like I did earlier. So here's my first knot. Oop, I'm having a little trouble with it. Sorry for the shaky fingers. Okay, so there's my first knot, and then again I want to put a knot right on top of it. So here is the second knot. And I wanted to show you this because I actually messed up. I didn't get the knots right on top of each other. So if you'll see here, they're near each other, but they're not right on top. And that's actually going to just pull right through the towel. So it's not large enough. So I'm going to put a third knot in and try and encompass both of those second knots, both of those two knots together to make one large three-knotted knot. Okay, and I've got that right here. So a nice large knot, and I'm just going to clip off the edge. And so now we have our gathering, and I'm just going to kind of zhuzh it a little bit, move it around, make it even, make it look nice before I put it inside of the handle piece. So I'm going to open up the handle piece, and I'm placing the unfinished but gathered edge of the towel into there, and I'm doing about an inch or so into there because I want to make sure that when I sew this together, I'm not catching the edges of that unfinished towel. And I'm just going to sew straight across. So again, I'm going to be using just a regular stitch on this, just a regular straight stitch. And I adjust it just a little bit. You could use any kinds of stitches that you have on your machine. There's decorative ones and everything, but I'm just going to use that straight stitch. And you don't need to change the up and down, but you do need to change, you may want to change the length to make it just a tiny bit longer. I'm not going up the full range. It can go all the way to 5, but I'm not going to do that. So here I am sewing. When you begin sewing, you make sure that you do a few stitches forward and then you do a few stitches backwards. So you can press your reverse button on your machine to go back and then go forward again. And of course you always want to take the pins out as you're sewing. In fact, you want to take them out right before you get to them if you can. Because if you leave them in, sometimes it can actually damage the needle that's in the machine. Okay, so now what I've done is, in order to keep my sewing without having to keep stopping and starting, I have put down the needle on the machine through the fabric, turned it in the direction I need it to go, and then put my presser foot back down, and then I sewed forward just a little bit. In fact, I sewed forward just a little bit too much, so I'm going to go back just a few stitches. Okay, so right there, and then I'm going to pick up my presser foot again, turn my fabric. Remember, the needle has to be down in there so it doesn't move it out of place. And that's the direction I need to go. So I'm going to put my presser foot back down and then just sew again till I get close to the edge. And I'm sewing basically kind of like a rectangle, like a really long, thin rectangle on the front. So I got to the edge, or towards the edge. And I'm going to make sure that my needle's down. Pick up the presser foot, turn it one last time. Put the presser foot back down, and I'm just going to have a few stitches in here. Oop, I had put it the wrong way. Here we go. So now it's the right way. Put the presser foot back down and stitch a few stitches ahead. And don't forget to do your reverse stitch, so your back stitch, to lock it into place. And then you can pull everything out and trim off the threads. And this is my finished product, or the finished product before we put in the buttonhole and the button. Next is the buttonhole. So we're going to make a buttonhole using our machine. For that, we're going to need the buttonhole foot for the machine. This is adjustable for the size of your button. You place the button in the back part of it and then clamp it down. Oh, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. I think I need to turn the button over. There we go. Clamp it into place. And this is going to tell the machine how long your buttonhole needs to be. Okay, and then right there's where your button is, and right down there is the little bar that's actually, we're going to use that to place it in place of the regular presser foot. So there's a little knob in the back. I'm going to press it, and I'm just going to drop my presser foot, and I'm just going to remove that off. It's an A foot. And then I'm going to pull my buttonhole foot in, and you're going to have to lift the presser foot just a little bit to get it underneath, and then you just put it down over the bar, and it's locks into place. And then you're going to pull it down this little contraption in the back, and it lines up against that part of the presser foot. And this is really important. You have to do it in order to sew the buttonhole foot. Okay, so now I have my fabric in place, and I'm sewing the foot in. Had a little trouble right here, but I have fixed it. And there we go. So I am not having to pull or really do much of anything to the fabric as it's going through. The machine is doing most of the work here. I'm just kind of guiding it, making sure it doesn't go out of place at some point. And as you can see, it's almost done with the buttonhole. And the machine will stop itself. At that point, you pick up your presser foot and you trim your threads, and here you go. There is my buttonhole. There's a little bit of an error on it, and that's because I had a problem with the machine. But as you can see, it doesn't look bad, and our button is probably going to end up covering some of that. So next, we need to actually make the hole. So I start off with a seam ripper to make the initial hole there at the bottom. Some people start in the middle. I had no problem starting at the bottom. The biggest thing is that you do not want to rip the actual stitches. You want it that just that fine line. So I have a very small pair of scissors. These are embroidery scissors, and I'm cutting, just very carefully cutting that line down the middle, so as not to cut the stitches. And then I'm just going to trim some excess thread off. Just to clean up the edges a little bit. Okay, and so that's the back. And I'm going to clip a little bit of thread right there. Okay, so lovely. That's our buttonhole. Now I'm going to determine where to put the button, because the button's going to go underneath this on the turquoise fabric. So I'm lining it up close to the end of where the handle meets the towel. And I'm going to get a pen, and I actually just used an ink pen for this. It's what I had handy. And I'm just going to draw a line down the middle of the hole. Okay, and so it made a line on the fabric, and that's okay because it's going to be covered up by the button. And then I'm just going to place a little bitty line right there across that the first line, over where the towel is. That's actually the edge of where the towel is. That's why I'm putting that line there. Okay, so next we're going to sew the button on. I do this hand sewing. Just get some thread. You want to thread your needle. You want to thread it. You want to actually do a double thread in the needle. So you basically just pull your thread halfway through, in half through the needle hole, and then you tie the two ends together into a knot. You don't have to do a double knot here, but you can if you want to. There's our knot. Okay, and so now I'm going to start sewing. I'm actually start sewing from the front on this one because it's a button. The button's going to cover the thread right there. And I'm going to stitch through in the same spot once or twice just to give it some strength. Here we go again. Okay, and then here's my button. I changed buttons. So now is the hard part. So I'm going to come up through the top hole, one of the top holes on this time on the left, and then I'm going to cross over to the bottom hole on the right and just pull that through. What I'm doing now is I am sliding the embroidery needle that I used earlier, and I'm sliding it underneath that first stitch that I've done, that cross stitch I've done for the button. And I'm doing this to provide some wiggle room for the button. You don't want your button to be really tight up against your fabric. You want that, just that little bit of wiggle room, and this is going to provide that. Some buttons come with shanks. This one does not, and so again, this is going to provide that bit of space that you need. And just to let you know, I screwed up the filming on this part. So I've got the stitching in, but what I did not show, what I'm not going to show you in the video, is that after I've done my 3 or 4 or 5 stitches, cross stitches, I wind the thread underneath the button around and around 2 or 3 times, and then I tie off. And so this is our finished product. I have 2 towels. One of them's long and one of them's a little shorter. Thanks for watching, and happy sewing!